Okay, well, perhaps we'll get started if everybody's found something to eat and a place to sit down. Thanks for being here so early. We have a full day, and good morning. And I'm Adam Green, and on behalf of all of us here at Georgetown, it's really an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to today's meeting on the cognition of belief. I want to start by thanking all of you who are attending and participating today. And I want to acknowledge a few people in particular here at the top of the day. First and foremost, I'd like to direct grateful acknowledgement to the John Templeton Foundation, with special thanks to Nick Gibson and Kimon Sargent, who are here with us. Yes. Absolutely. The efforts of the Templeton Foundation have really awakened interest in the empirical exploration of the cognition of belief over the last few years. And the growing momentum in this research space is really very clearly traceable to initiatives that Nick and Kimon have led. And Nick will be speaking with us later today about sort of where we stand as a field and what's on the horizon. And he'll be giving particular attention to priorities and opportunities at Templeton that are going to support our next steps as a field. Grateful thanks are also due to our colleagues at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. We thank Claudia Winkler, Melody Fox-Ahmed, Tom Banshoff, Michael Kessler, Tom Farr, Timothy Shaw, and especially Carly Henry, who's in the back there, for months, quite literally months, of preparation, organization, and guidance in event planning. Thanks, Carly. And last, but by no means least, thanks to Nhi Din, who's my lab manager, and the many other members of my lab who are here today and who've been working for quite some time to make today happen. So thanks, guys, and also, yeah, thanks for waking up so early, earlier than I usually do. So today's convening is a component of a larger project on the cognition of belief, funded by the Templeton Foundation and by Nick in particular, and which our co-leader on the project, Zach Warren, will talk about later today. And as Zach will discuss, one of the things that's exciting about this area of research is the opportunity to consider how the relatively new science of mind and brain interacts with old questions and especially ancient divisions between believers of different faiths, which are, of course, very timely today. And in particular, as a neuroscientist thinking about belief, what's maybe most exciting to me is the idea that while beliefs vary across contexts and cultures, and members of one faith or faction might think of members of another group as fundamentally different from themselves, it's probably more true that the basic characteristics of a brain, and therefore a mind for those non-dualists among us, are likely to be very, very much the same no matter where that brain grows up or in what cultural, religious, or political context it's placed. And if that's true, then it may be that the brains of ostensibly opponent believers are actually manifesting belief very similarly, and that the development of belief across disparate faiths and factions may actually happen through shared neuro-cognitive pathways. And so if all of that's true, then it may be possible to think of mind and brain as kind of a safe space, kind of a neutral territory, where a conversation about deep-lying commonalities can begin. And here at Georgetown, which of course is an institution with a Jesuit heritage, and which is an institution that's made a strong commitment to dialogue and bridge building between different faiths and different groups and different cultures, it seems like an ideal place to convene that kind of discussion. So with that in mind, today's meeting convenes many of the world's leading scholars on religious cognition, and today will feature scientific research exploring the relationship of belief to basic elements of human cognition, which are common to human beings across cultures and across faiths. And with that, I'll say thanks to you all again, and hand it off to my dear colleague and project co-leader, Ali Moghadam.
Well, welcome. I'm Fatali Moghadam of Georgetown, and I'm not going to thank anybody. I do want to mention two things about why it's particularly timely to think about belief at this moment in our history. Around the beginning of the 20th century, modernization theories developed, and it was predicted that religion would become a thing of the past eventually, and science would take over, beliefs would become scientific. Well, that hasn't happened. I was born in a part of the world in Iran, where radicalization and religious beliefs are very important and very influential. That's why I left. And of course, the other factor why beliefs are particularly important to study now is because there seems to be not only a global wave of radicalization in different religions, but also a global wave of fundamentalism against facts and science and scientific thinking. And it's not just Trump in America. This happens to be a global wave. So I think it's a particularly apt time to explore beliefs. My other task is to alert you to the program. I know you have it in your hands or close to you, and to point out that there are two symposia, 1 and 2, and Adam is the discussant for the first one. I am the discussant for the second one. There will be time for questions at the end of each. And also, very importantly, there is a poster session next door. And that's going to be going on from 12:50 to 3 o'clock. We decided we would stop at 3, and then Zach Warren would have a bit more time to speak from 3 to 3:20. And then, of course, we have the keynote address at the end of the day from Jordan Grafman. Thank you very much for your participation, and we're going to start the first panel. Thank you.
So yeah, there are a lot of really interesting reasons to study what belief is made of, and we'll get to explore some of them. The first panel, I think it's useful as we get started to contextualize a little bit, and I think Ali started to do that. You know, we're at this moment of fake news and alternative facts, and so do people believe these things? If so, what is that belief made of? And I think one of the exciting things about this moment, again, in sort of this burgeoning science of mind and brain, is that we get to ask questions that are a little bit deeper. So there's the standard questions about belief are, you know, whom do you believe? What do you believe? But I think we're now at a place where we can start to ask questions about how do you believe? Mechanistic questions, how and why type questions. And it's these deeper sort of mechanisms of mind and brain that support belief that the speakers in the first panel will be addressing. And so we have with us a distinguished panel. We have Miguel Farias from Oxford and Coventry, Neil Van Leeuwen from Georgia State University, and Will Gervais from the University of Kentucky. And so these guys will begin to address some of these mechanistic questions. And following each talk, we'll hopefully have time for a question or two. And then we're going to take some time at the end for a group Q&A. So if you have questions, maybe you can ask them at the end of one talk. Maybe you keep that in mind until the group Q&A at the end of the session. So let's get rolling now. And our first speaker today is Dr. Miguel Farias.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Very grateful to the John Templeton Foundation, to Adam Green for having me, and my colleague Jonathan Jung. So I'm originally from Portugal, Lisbon. I've been in England for 17 years looking at belief. Not just belief, but also the other side of it, unbelief. So as an experimental personality and social psychologist, I conduct experiments on people And I've tried to get hold of everything I could. So from field studies to lab experiments to brain imaging to brain stimulation. And what I'd like to share with you today is just a snippet of some things which our lab has been developing for the last 2-3 years. And at the same time that I present some of these results, I'd like to challenge them and challenge some of the ideas that we as researchers also have. And I mean, particularly when we talk to the media, we may portray, and once it is in the media, they twist it again and again. So for the last 2 or 3 years, I have become more reflective and concerned about a somewhat biased set of ideas of what religion consists of and where it comes from. And this is happening not just about what belief or lack of it may be about, but also with religious practices. So let me just start by giving you an example. So meditation is a religious practice which has been used for a long time across world religious traditions, but in the last 20 to 40 years, it has become a tool within psychologists' resources, a tool for therapy and well-being. And this is how the meditating mind is usually portrayed. So it is a quiet, peaceful mind, very much like that tranquil lake. So if you meditate, your mind will become like this. On the other hand, if you do not meditate, your mind will feel very much like this, a cubist maze. Now, I'm not making this up. If you attend any talk by psychologists or neuroscientists on meditation, they will either show you these very same slides, and I borrowed this from a colleague at the Oxford Mindfulness Center, or they will convey something very similar. And after that, they will move on to present the evidence for the wonderful effects of meditation. So it quiets your monkey mind, lowers your stress, your heart rate, and of course, most importantly, as we'll hear later today, it changes your brain. And it does this through a variety of ways. And of course, it also makes you happier. Right. This is an image from transcendental meditators apparently levitating in the 70s. They're actually hopping. This will promote these hopping contests when you're in deep meditation. Now, how does this translate into the cognition of belief? Now, when it comes to the mind, we are also faced by a variety of symbols and somewhat stereotypical images, usually dividing the mind into 2 major aspects. So this can be referred to either as intuitive and analytical thinking, head and heart knowledge, hot and cold cognition. And there is, of course, a history to this. It didn't just develop in the last 20, 30, or even 100 years. There is a philosophical, historical background to this. And it's very similar to what we're talking also today about religion and science. So the perceived conflict between religion and science has been enunciated for the last 300 and 400 years as this conflict between what Pessoa calls the emotional need to believe and the rational impossibility of believing. If you go further back, 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, this was not a problem for philosophers and theologians back then. But it is now. And something which, again, is portrayed in much of our experimental psychological research these days is that religious people are understood as less rational or analytical. And again, this is coming from this historical Enlightenment tradition. Now, you're probably familiar with various dual models of information processing. This one I'm showing here, is by Epstein, but it's very, very similar to most of the other ones. You have one system which is more analytical, logical, conscious, and the other which is more automatic, emotional, and unconscious. Back in 2008, so before this last surge of experimental research on dual processing thinking and religion took off, I heard Epstein give a talk, and towards the end of his talk, he mentioned religion as coming under the experiential or intuitive system. So I read some of his stuff, and back then I was finishing a study on pilgrimage, where we were comparing different kinds of motivation and experiences that pilgrims have, whether they are going on Christian pilgrimages to places such as Lourdes, or if they're going to places of pagan pilgrimage, such as Stonehenge for the winter or summer solstice. So we were doing one more place, the way to Santiago. What's particular about Santiago today is that you have about 50% of religious people, and the other 50 would be either atheists, agnostics, or people just exploring what they're going to do with the rest of their life, hitting a midlife crisis, or just finishing their undergraduate degrees and what the hell am I going to do now? So we packed up our questionnaires and a task which Epstein has been using to differentiate between intuitive and analytical thinking. It's a probability task where you have two containers, you're blind, you look at them, you're asked to make a choice, where do you want to try to get the color bead from, you're blindfolded, and then you try to take one. What's interesting about this is that the odds are always better on the smaller container, but it only has one color bead, while the one where the odds are lower has lots of beads. So your intuition tells you, oh, there's so many more beads here. And then your logical thinking will tell you, yes, but the right choice is the right-hand one. So we were interested in seeing whether there was any difference in terms of intuitive analytical processing in relation to pilgrims' level of supernatural beliefs, as well as their levels of commitment, since they were walking, some of them, for 30 days. We didn't find either. So I forgot about this for 2 or 3 years until this study came out by Lindemann, in which she showed that the rejection of supernatural belief was associated with a stronger activation of the right inferior frontal gyrus. So the right inferior frontal gyrus is associated with, or underpinned by, is associated with cognitive inhibition. And this is usually known as a process in which you either stop or withhold the mental processes or an impulse. So this is particularly relevant for people who have addictive or aggressive behaviors. But here she is claiming, so she's claiming that people who are able to withhold their response to seeing supernatural signs in a task like this, they're actually enhancing using more their cognitive inhibition. So we thought of replicating this in an experiment. So we got hold of her task. We got people to train using a stop signal task to increase their levels of cognitive inhibition. And we used a different task, which is now commonly used, the cognitive reflection task, as a standard measure of dual processing. Again, we didn't get any interesting results, so no correlation whatsoever between intuitive or analytical thinking and seeing signs. We only got what we'd expect in terms of individual differences, that people who claim to be or endorse stronger spiritual beliefs would tend to see more signs in this. So nothing of particularly exciting until then. But we were confronted with this interesting question about cognitive inhibition and religious belief. If religion, as cognitive science of religion argues, is natural and we are hardwired to believe, how do we explain something like non-belief? And the demographics of non-belief or unbelief are growing. So either skeptical individuals do not have the propensity to believe in the supernatural in the first place, and of course, if that is the case, it casts doubt on the naturalness of religion idea, or they inhibit this tendency, as Lindemann was suggesting with this fMRI study. So we decided to do a neural stimulation study where we would manipulate cognitive inhibition across a variety of participants with different religious backgrounds. And instead of using TMS, which is more, precise but painful and more difficult to create, sort of double-blind procedure, we went for transcranial direct current stimulation, where we had either nodal stimulation or placebo. And we had a set of implicit tests of supernatural attributions and beliefs. For those who haven't seen, this is a sort of apparatus you have. This is the TDCS stimulator, and you have 2 electrodes which are attached to the person's head. All right. Okay. Yep. So we were expecting that by using that device and applying a nodal stimulation would increase neural excitability in this area, the right inferior frontal gyrus. This would lead to enhanced cognitive inhibition and a decrease in supernatural belief when compared to sham stimulation. Just very quickly, so to check whether the cognitive inhibition stimulation was working, we just used a very standard task, a stop signal task, where people are asked to inhibit their response in a number of trials. We use again the standard cognitive reflection task as a measure of intuitive analytical thinking, and we had a couple of tasks. So Lindemann tasks and Jonathan Jong's, my colleague's implicit association task, which has been also used often. And just to give you an idea, his task asks participants to associate religious and spiritual stimuli with real or imaginary categories. So you'd expect a religious person to much more quickly associate religious spiritual stimuli with real rather than imaginary, and the opposite with the unbelievers. In terms of demographics, we had about 50 people of different religious backgrounds. About 40% were either atheist or agnostic. Now, we managed to get the cognitive inhibition stimulation as we expected, and we had a small but significant effect both on the supernatural attribution task and on the implicit association supernatural belief task. Right, so moving from real to imaginary. So these are the sort of good news. So the stimulation to this area of the brain was associated with an increase in cognitive inhibition, a decrease in supernatural attributions, and a decrease in implicit belief in the supernatural. On the other hand, like for the previous studies, we had no association between baseline measures of supernatural belief and intuitive thinking in the cognitive reflection task. So what is happening here? Does cognitive inhibition modulate belief by blocking the intuitive system? I think this is unlikely. This would mean that non-believers would need to inhibit supernatural attributions recurrently, so throughout their daily lives. This would be a very considerable use of cognitive resources that would weaken their ability to inhibit other thoughts, feelings, and actions. Now, cognitive inhibition is a mechanism which might explain modulation of belief, but clearly does not address the origins of belief, right? And it might work in this way. Imagine that you're confronted with a situation in your life in which you think, oh, this is because God wanted this to happen, or this is my karma. So it may work very much like a conditioned response, right? It can decrease the strength of the association between a certain event and the supernatural agent. Now, where am I going with all this? So both psychologists, cognitive psychologists, and also some anthropologists have been portraying humans as born believers. The idea is that we have a set of cognitive dispositions that are congenial to make us anthropomorphize and describe causality to invisible, powerful beings. And religious beliefs also, as we know, seem to provide us with a sense of comfort and alleviation of our human fragility. Now, while I do not dispute that there is some truth to this, I think we are only telling half of the story. And this is not a recent story. These ideas, which the sort of father of cognitive science of religion, Stuart Guthrie, thought about, these ideas have been suggested by other people for a while, including Darwin. So when I began looking for historical predecessors to the CSR ideas, the historian John Brooke pointed me to various sources, including this quote by Darwin, where he's talking about his dog. So one summer day, the dog suddenly barked at a parasol swaying in the breeze. Darwin surmised that he must have reasoned to himself that movement without any apparent cause indicated the presence of some strange living agent, and that no stranger had a right to be on his territory. Now, it seems to me that it is Darwin and not the dog who is seeing an invisible agent and anthropomorphizing the behavior of his dog. It's interesting that Darwin even considers that his dog reasoned, that is, the dog made a causal inference. Now, Darwin, like his contemporaries who had some contacts with pre-industrial or so-called tribal societies, he was struck by their animistic beliefs. But Darwin's bewilderment with animistic beliefs is probably saying more about his own Anglican religious background, mostly devoid of symbolic thinking, than of the people who endorse a rich symbolism in nature and act and interact in the world in a very different way. Right. So I'm not completely convinced, either conceptually or empirically, that we have a hyperactive agency detection device. Just a few months ago, I was at the American Academy of Religion conference, and after the first panel on the cognitive science of religion, someone asked if CSR and the HAD was just a neo-colonial concept, meaning that we get all these affluent Western white males trying to come up with explanations for why people who live in funny, exotic places of the world and were not educated at Oxford, Princeton, or Georgetown University believe in all these weird things. I think there is a point in this criticism, and in what concerns the HAD, I have for the last year or so been collecting ethnographic accounts of how Westerners who visit tribal societies actually perceive when they are in the jungle. And I'll just give you one of these accounts by Daniel Everett, who's a linguist who spent some years actually, living with the Piraha tribe in the Amazon. So he was walking back with an adolescent from this tribe, and it was dark, and he couldn't see anything. But this adolescent stopped him and said, "Look, there's a caiman up ahead." A caiman is a small crocodile, not as aggressive as the alligators or crocodiles we get. So he directs his beam of flashlight up the path and does not see a thing. And the tribal teenager tells him, "Turn off that lighting thing in your hand and look in the dark." So he looked in the dark and he saw absolutely nothing. "What are you talking about? There is nothing up ahead." The teenager giggled and he says that my inability to see beyond my nose is a source of constant merriment among the Pirahas. I never see anything while they see everything. So this boy rushes up ahead, gets a stick, hits something in the head, and brings back this caiman by the tail. So Everett concludes that urban folks like me look for cars, bicycles, and pedestrians in the path, not prehistoric reptiles. Now, while these anecdotes are interesting, they always tell the same story. The natives don't have any HUD or perceive any ambiguity. They clearly see the stimuli in the jungle. It's the Westerners who either don't see a thing or start imagining things when they are in such an unfamiliar environment. And I see that my time is up, but I just wanted to very briefly mention the other aspect of this in relation to CSR, which is, so the idea is that we are born believers, but there's quite a lot of historical evidence that we are all equally born unbelievers. I mean, going back to, of course, the famous incredulity of St. Thomas, this wasn't just a one-off symptom. There's a rich history of doubt within, Judeo-Christianity. So the history of unbelief is probably as old as the history of belief. And of course, things keep changing. There's now almost about 50% of people in the UK who claim to have no religion. And this leads us to think that we don't just have to look at belief. We need to look at what's happening with so-called unbelievers. What is it that they believe in? Do they implicitly believe in something supernatural or not, really? I mean, I have a sweet colleague who's always telling me that even in Scandinavia, Icelanders believe in fairies. I think that would be the exception rather than the norm. Anyway, I just want to finish by plugging in a recent large project we have also funded by the John Templeton Foundation, in which we're looking at unbelief. So I hope that in 3 years' time we'll have a few more answers and plenty more questions. Thank you very much.
So I think let's take time for just one question now, and again we'll have a Q&A at the end. There's a microphone that'll move around the room. If you have a burning question, now's a good chance. And if
Leave it for later.
And if not, then I think in the interest of time, we'll keep going and we'll ask questions soon enough. So our next speaker today is Neil Van Leeuwen from Georgia State.
Okay, great. There's my clicker. And one thing, I know there's not a lot of time, a lot of interesting things going on today. So in the interest of being most useful to all of you, I put my most important ideas on the first slide. And you can think of everything as kind of an elaboration of that. What I want to rehash for you today is a debate that I recently had with another philosopher. So I'm in the philosophy department at Georgia State University. And the other philosopher's name is also Neil. It's Neil Levy. And what we were debating about is what explains why religious believers often don't act on their internal beliefs. They have these beliefs that are so important to them, to who they are. Yet we all know that in a broad range of cases, religious believers, so think of the phrase once-a-week Christian, might not act on these internal beliefs. And I'll give you some examples of empirically validated, what I call representation-discrepant behavior. But I want to say, first and foremost, the interesting question here is, what's the best paradigm? What's the best kind of exemplar for explaining representation-discrepant behavior? So I'll start with the other Neil's suggestion. And he suggests the physicist. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So if you think about this gentleman here is a physicist, doesn't always use his theoretical beliefs about physics when, say, estimating when a ball will hit the ground or how long it will take for a wheel to roll down. In fact, very often, there's plenty of evidence that even people who are well trained in physics, they don't use their theoretical beliefs, but rather they use their more intuitive physics in estimating what happens. And why is that? Well, disfluency is a good explanation. It's too hard in real time to calculate d equals 1/2 gt squared for the sake of estimating when a ball is going to hit the ground. It's just too disfluent. The processing of those internal representations is too slow. So sometimes you don't act in accord with your internal theoretical beliefs. And what Neil suggests, the other Neil Levy suggests, is that maybe religious representations are something like that. Maybe the idea that God is watching doesn't get processed fluently enough to affect our behavior all the time. So that's paradigm one, the physicist. I have a very different explanation for why it is that many religious people don't always act on their internal religious beliefs. My paradigm is what you might call the playground. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take this young girl right here. And let's say she's playing a game of make-believe, and you might see that there's, let's see, is this a laser? No, there we go. This little green piece of paper right here. Say she's pretending that that's a frog. Well, once the make-believe play ends, she's not going to keep acting like that's a frog. Rather, she's going to continue to act like it's a green piece of paper. But one of the representations, her make-believe representation, is going to cease guiding action outside what we might call the practical setting of make-believe play. And so a suggestion that I've been putting forward for a few years now is that not all religious beliefs, but a broad range of what I call religious credences have that feature of practical setting dependence. They're different from ordinary matter-of-fact beliefs in that they guide behavior primarily on a certain sort of stage or a certain sort of sacred context. And so contrary to what Levy thinks, where it's disfluency that gives rise to failure to act on internal representations, it's the fact that those internal representations are what I call practical setting dependent. And another way of thinking about this is that, like in make-believe play, there's a two-map cognitive structure when it comes to much religious cognition. You have your mundane, ordinary factual beliefs about the world, namely, this is a green piece of paper. But then you also have a secondary map that is more imaginative in character. So how are we going to decide? Now, you might all, of course, have your own explanations for this phenomenon of representation-discrepant behavior. And of course, if you have paradigms of your own, I'd encourage you float them. But I'm going to discuss why I think Levy's explanation is not going to work. But before we do that, let me just outline what else I'm going to be doing in the 10 minutes I have remaining. So a few examples just to get a clearer idea of the behavioral phenomenon that I'm talking about and trying to explain. Go a little bit more in detail on what Levy is saying about disfluency. Say why I think Levy is wrong. I think many religious representations are highly intuitive. And then here's a critical move. Say what I think he's missing, right? He's missing the mundane character of ordinary factual beliefs. And then if there's time, suggest a couple of future research directions. So let's get going. Representation-discrepant behavior. Many of you probably know some of this literature already. But let's just consider pornography use in the Bible Belt. So there's been some studies of this, and it turns out that in the Bible Belt, pornography use and buying porn online dips on Sunday. People take a break on Sunday from using porn. Why might you? Well, God is watching, right? You have the religious credence that God is watching, and so you're less likely to use porn. The finding, however, is also that Bible Belt use of pornography is higher during the rest of the week. And you might find that a little bit puzzling. If you think that God is watching, it should at least lower the porn use every day of the week. Charitable giving shows the opposite pattern. More charitable giving on Sunday, less during the rest of the week. So it seems as if for 6 days a week, people are just not acting in accord with their internal representations of God's awareness of their actions. Oops, wrong way. Another example, this is one of my favorites. So Paul Harris and Rita Astuti did a study, and this has been replicated in various places. But they basically showed that when you prime people with a naturalistic context, so like a bird dying or something like that, and then you ask them about their ancestors, this is among the Vezo tribe in Madagascar, it turns out that they're much less likely to say that their ancestors can see or think or have various other psychological properties. But if you ask them after a ritual prime and in ritual settings, they're much more likely to say that their ancestors can still see and think. So you get a kind of contextual toggling of the representation of the life of the ancestors. And again, representation-discrepant behavior, they're not talking in accordance with their supernatural beliefs, at least much of the time, when they're outside the ritual setting. I won't go into this example, but for interests of time, there's a person I've taken an interest in, Marcus Ross, PhD in geoscience from the University of Rhode Island, is also a young Earth creationist, and he compartmentalizes his beliefs to a great extent. So when he goes into the lab or into scientific conferences, he no longer talks in ways that are suggestive of his young Earth creationism, namely the idea that the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. And finally, a very cool study that came out in 2015, Eric Duhem did a study among the Moroccan shopkeepers in the Medina in Fez. I happen to have been there. It's a remarkable place, historically interesting. And what he found using a one-shot economic game is that within about 20 minutes after the call to prayer, 100% of the shopkeepers, who were all Muslim, would give the most charitable option. But then after that, it dropped to around 50%. So people were much less charitable outside that window around the call to prayer. So for me, it's the very brevity of that phenomenon is so striking. And just to have a broad category, it does seem to be that in each of these cases, we're getting representation-discrepant behavior. They have internal representations of the supernatural world as, say, watching them or encouraging them to give, and then outside certain contexts, those representations cease to guide behavior, even though, again, those representations are very, very important. So why might that be? Well, again, I kind of gave you the overview of what Neil Levy thinks. Here's a little bit more detail. there's a very interesting literature in cognitive psychology on disfluency. So what happens when you have a hard time processing certain representations? Say a font is hard to read, or a sentence has a complicated syntax. And the finding is that disfluency makes you less likely to accept a certain representation. It causes you to engage in analytic processing, and it maybe makes you just a little bit more skeptical overall. So Levy's suggestion is that those internal religious representations are disfluent. They're hard to process, and that makes them unintuitive. So Levy says religious beliefs do not differ from many scientific beliefs in being counterintuitive. And then his gloss on counterintuitive is just that if something is counterintuitive, people are less likely to accept it as true. Well, if that's what he thinks about religious representations and religious beliefs, then you might ask, well, why do people accept them at all? And his explanation is that processing fluency is sensitive to context. So in certain context, your internal representation of, say, God is watching is going to be processed more fluently. So say in the church or after the call to prayer, that's going to have more fluent processing, and that's why you're more likely to act on it. So you can see that the logical structure of Neil Levy's explanation for representation-discrepant behavior is quite ingenious. He's building up an explanation out of components that are pretty well evidenced in the literature in cognitive psychology. And what he's aiming at, in contrast to my overall view, is what you would call a one-map as opposed to a two-map cognitive structure. So he's basically saying that the religious beliefs fit in together with the factual beliefs. Contrary to what I say, it's all just one map, but certain portions of it are harder to process. Well, again, I want to give Neil his credit. Ingenious explanation. Unfortunately, I think it's dead wrong. Why? Well, there's a great deal of reason to think, details aside, that popular religious representations, as opposed to what you might think of as abstruse theological doctrines, are highly intuitive in nature. What that means is that they're amenable to processing by our intuitive systems, so our intuitive representations of agency, our intuitive representations of psychology, and then also our intuitive representations of the physical world. And I have just a couple of, or three of the many references that point in this direction, which suggest that given the intuitive systems that humans have, religious representations are more memorable for being minimally counterintuitive. So that means that when you have, say, a representation of a divinity, the divinity is mostly like an agent with maybe one or two or three counterintuitive properties. Well, the flip side of being minimally counterintuitive is being, that's right, mostly intuitive. Okay, and I'm aware Miguel just raised some questions about this, but there's also a very interesting literature which suggests that people who are less analytic in cognitive style and more intuitive in cognitive style are more likely to be religious believers. So the sum total of this is to say that Neil Levy's suggestion that it's lack of fluency and hence lack of intuitiveness that explains why people don't act on their internal religious representations gets the intuitiveness piece of the puzzle exactly wrong. And let me just present a quote from Bob McCauley down at Emory University from his aptly titled book, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. And this is something I quote in my response to Levy. Religion, in its popular, that is widespread forms, incorporates assumptions that are more common, materials that are more familiar, and judgments that are more intuitive than is the case with either science or theology. So I'm pretty confident that Neil has gotten things wrong, and the question is just, well, why? And my view of the situation is that he's missing just how ordinary and common it is to have matter-of-fact, mundane matter-of-fact beliefs. So when I talk about factual beliefs and when I differentiate them from religious credences, I'm talking about the stable base in our multi-map cognitive structures. And without giving you my theory of factual beliefs, there's obviously not enough time for that. Let's just think of some examples. My neighbor has a dog. Dogs have teeth. My house has 2 exterior doors. I have N dollars in the bank. US currency is the dollar. So when Neil Levy conflates religious beliefs with factual beliefs, I think he does so without a proper awareness of just how mundane and ordinary and easy to miss regular factual beliefs are. But the truth is we all have a great reservoir of factual information about the world that mostly guides behavior in the background. And when I say religious credence is not factual belief, what I'm saying is religious credence is not like that, is not like these mundane representations or attitudes that have the content, my house has 2 exterior doors. All right, so let's wrap this up. I've got 2 minutes. What are some predictions? Remember, these are kind of big paradigms that I'm suggesting. So they're ways of thinking that can be illuminating but really need to be developed. So what are some ways to develop the playground paradigm that I'm suggesting? So first of all, if it's true that many religious beliefs, in particular those ones that I'm calling religious credences, are practical setting dependent, you would expect people to construct practical settings specifically with the aim of activating that set of internal religious beliefs. So just like when we go back to the young girl on the playground is a certain kind of space that's meant to activate her imaginative representations. Well, you might expect sacred times and places, if my paradigm is the correct one, to exist. And of course, that's not so much of a prediction as a gloss on things that we've already noticed, but it does cohere with the paradigm I'm suggesting. Second, we should think that there won't be confusion. If there's a 2-map cognitive structure, and if religious credence is a second map level, then say someone who is taking the communion wafer won't actually get confused and expect it to taste like human flesh or something like that. So as much as you sincerely avow that this wafer is the body of Christ, you're not going to be confused as you would if you ordinarily factually believed that. So non-confusion is an idea that I take from the literature and the developmental psychology of pretend play as something that's been well documented. And I think non-confusion is a mark to look at when we think about how people interact with religious props. And then finally, this is something that is definitely hopeful for the future. So there's been a little bit of work that suggests that minimally counterintuitive ideas of the supernatural are processed in the brain in ways similar to metaphorical cognition, a very interesting paper by Fondavia and colleagues on that. But there needs to be more investigating that. So, but if my paradigm is the correct one, then we can expect the neural signatures of religious credence to be similar, or at least more similar to fictional imaginings than to ordinary factual beliefs. So let me just wrap up. I'm presenting religious credences as a kind of secondary cognitive attitude, so a layer of our representations of the world that are not confused with factual beliefs. Rather, they're in fundamental ways similar to fictional imaginings, but they're like fictional imaginings that are partially identity constituting. So they're still incredibly serious. They're still something that determines who you commune with and so on. But a lot of the structure of religious actions is going to be similar in nature to make-believe play. Again, this is the paradigm I'm suggesting. Factual beliefs, by way of contrast, are so mundane that you hardly notice them. And in conclusion, it's the practical setting dependence, or the playground, that explains religious representation-discrepant behavior, explains why we don't always act on our internal religious beliefs. Thank you.
Okay, I see two questions, and perhaps we have time for both, so
I'll be quick.
great. Yeah?
Yeah, thanks. You talk about religious beliefs, and you're making a metaphor with pretend play. And I assume you did that as a deliberate choice rather than just talking about regular contextual beliefs. So if you're outside at a picnic and you ask someone, if it rains, will everything get wet? They'll say yes. If you're in a living room, they might say no. So most beliefs are contextual. We know that from cognitive science. But what you're saying is that it's more like it's in the realm of hypothetical thinking and make believe rather
Yes.
than just a merely contextualized belief.
Yes, that's exactly right. So that's a good distinction, and that's one that I develop in my work. But any representation is going to be sensitive to relevance. So that's if a certain representation isn't relevant to a given question or a given action, even factual beliefs, you're not going to deploy them in the crafting of the action. But what you might notice about the representation-discrepant behaviors that I went through is that the internal beliefs are relevant. So the question of whether God is watching is just as relevant to the question of whether you give charity during the call to prayer or not during the call to prayer. And same thing for the other examples. So the kind of this phenomenon of practical setting dependence, it really is a different kind of contextual sensitivity from the one you were talking about, which seems to be more a matter of relevance. So briefly to sum up, relevance makes everything sensitive to context in a certain way, as you just illustrated with your example of the picnic. But there's a further kind of sensitivity to practical setting, which I think obtains both for make-believe play and for not all, but a very broad range of religious beliefs.
John?
So you draw the distinction, you use Bob McCauley's distinction between religion and theology earlier as a way of criticizing Neil's ideas about whether or not religious beliefs are intuitive or fluent or whatever. So, okay, let's try to channel Bob. I think he would say that the belief that God has wants, God has desires, is intuitive, right?
Yeah.
Is religion in his terms.
That sounds like Bob, yeah.
Right. But I think the belief that you can represent as God does not want you to pay for pornography, I think Bob might think that's theology, right? So anthropomorphism in general is religion, but then particular propositions about God's particular desires, that seems like theology. In which case, I'm not sure the classic examples you give, which are God wants you to give money to the poor, or God wants you not to pay for pornography. I'm not sure you can easily just say, all right, like science tells us that these are intuitive beliefs, because even I think under Bob's scheme, they might count as formal religion rather than folk religion, as it were.
I think I just disagree with that. So you don't need any abstruse theology to know that God doesn't want you to look at porn, right? I mean, that's very intuitive and.
But that's not what Bob means by intuitive, right? So for Bob, intuitive is a very kind of like strict definition. So it's things that are the as it were, the natural outputs of evolved cognitive processes. And unless you think that we evolved the belief that God doesn't want us to pay for porn, then you must think that it's the belief that requires cultural scaffolding, which then Bob would categorize as theology. Any proposition that requires cultural scaffolding is theology.
No, I think you're doing injustice to Bob there. So he's not. So this is Bob McCauley that I referred to earlier. So he's not saying that all the intuitive religious beliefs are encoded in our evolutionary system. Rather, he's saying that they're apt for being processed by both our evolved intuitive systems and then our highly practiced, what he would call practiced natural intuitive systems. And I think, although of course we didn't, back in the course of evolutionary history, evolve the belief that God doesn't want us looking at porn, I think it is fair to say that kind of normative belief about what a supernatural agent wants is one that is perfectly intuitively processable And just to highlight the contrast between me and Neil Levy, it's not, it doesn't take difficult, conscious, logical reasoning to grasp what's going on there.
It sounds like there's more here. We're going for burgers and beers later, so let's maybe continue it then.
Yeah,
Just
thanks.
in the interest of time. Yeah, so our next speaker is Will Gervais, University of Kentucky.
Let's find this. Cool. Well, thank you for organizing and for hosting us. It should be a fascinating day. So the theme of this is on understanding the cognition of belief. So naturally, I'm going to dive right in and talk about people who don't believe. So basically, the whole talk is about atheists. But I really think that understanding atheists and religious disbelief, it kind of represents a crucial test case in any theories we develop about how religious belief actually works. So any good theory has to explain both belief and disbelief and what is associated with either one. So most of my research starts from a simple observation that most people in the world do seem to hold various religious beliefs, but at the same time, we have a large and potentially growing number of non-believers out there. So I'm really interested in what's going on at the cognitive, cultural, or motivational levels that explains why some people are believers, some people aren't. And then I also consider what are the consequences of either religious belief or religious disbelief. And the main thing I'll be talking about today is looking at some of the consequences of religious disbelief. Here, I can laser that one maybe. There we go. Especially one of the main consequences of religious disbelief, at least from a social psychological perspective, is it's carrying a whole bunch of stigma. So in most religious majority countries, people really have negative perceptions of non-believers. And I think this stigma actually can feed back, and it has the potential to actually mess with our theories of religious cognition. So hopefully that'll become clear as we dive into it. And I think I have this, it'll pop up back at the end. So a lot of the work I'll be talking about just recently was published, and you can download a free preprint of it if you want for all the juicy details. So really, most of this work is going to be asking one simple question. So how many atheists are there? Any guesses out there? Let's go globally.
So I think your paper says that the estimate you guys came up with was about 26% of the American population.
Yeah, buzzkill. That's. I'm going to get to that. Yeah, fair enough. So for global estimates, Phil Zuckerman has estimated 500 to 700 million atheists worldwide. And to reach this estimate, he kind of combed through census data, various large-scale polls. But he admits that there's a whole lot of uncertainty in this estimate because the polls conducted across different countries, they don't always ask the same questions in the same ways. So he's kind of got a weird apples and oranges problem in terms of compiling all these various polls. Potentially a more tractable way to look at this is, let's say if we could look within one country where we have had standardized polls for a long time. So both Gallup and Pew, for example, have been running polls in the US for decades where they'll ask people about their religious beliefs in various ways. So let's forget that. What would you guess is the percentage of atheists in the US? 25. There we go, pretty close. What's interesting is you'll come up with different atheist prevalence estimates in the US depending on how the question is asked. And the different polling firms tend to ask the question in different ways. So for example, Pew, they'll give people like a menu of religious identities, and they'll ask people to check one. So are you Catholic? Are you Protestant? Are you Baptist? Are you Hindu? Are you Sikh? Are you atheist? Are you agnostic? They have typically just a none box where you can say I'm none of the above. So their atheism prevalence estimate is around 3%. So 3% of Americans will actually check the atheist box. What's interesting though is, so Gallup, instead of kind of giving people this menu, they take a more definitional approach where they ask people, do you believe in God, yes or no? The people who say no are by definition atheists. So now instead of people kind of actively identifying with the tag atheist, they can just say, no, I don't believe in God. And that question generates an estimate of around 10 or 11%. So you just change the wording a little bit, all of a sudden your estimate changes a whole bunch. And I suspect, and I'll show you data, that these estimates are far too low, in part because of how they're conducted. So typically these polls are nationally representative telephone polls. So imagine you're sitting at home one day and the phone rings and then somebody says, oh, do you believe in God? This is kind of strange, and it might not give us good, unbiased, honest answers to that question, because those of us with a social psych background, we know that self-reports are not always trustworthy, especially if you have kind of a socially loaded topic that you're asking people about. So there's all sorts of things that people might believe or behaviors they engage in, and if you ask them whether or not they do that, they're not just going to fess up and tell you. And I suspect that atheism is exactly one of these things, again, because there is profound social stigma against religious disbelief in the US. So to illustrate some of the stigma against atheists, we've been doing studies for years now where I won't dive too much into the methods, but essentially how it works is you give people a description of somebody doing something immoral. So for instance, kicking a puppy, or engaging in some light cannibalism, or consensual incest. You give people a description of somebody breaking some sort of a moral norm, and then you can gauge who they intuitively assume the perpetrator is. And across all these studies, basically any moral violation we can come up with, people readily and intuitively assume that the perpetrator is an atheist. And it turns out even atheists themselves show the same effect, albeit to a lesser extent. All these studies were conducted in the US, but recently, well, it was recently accepted for publication. We started collecting data in 2013, but instead of just looking in the US, we were interested in kind of the cross-cultural variability in this effect. So is it just a weird American thing that people assume that immoral folks are atheists, or is it more cross-culturally generalizable? So we gave people a description of somebody who tortures animals as a child, and then when they grow up, they no longer get as much of a kick out of torturing animals, so they move on to hurting people. And the person now has the dismembered bodies of 5 homeless people buried in his basement. So this is an unambiguously immoral character. And we were interested in whether people would assume that the perpetrator was an atheist. Collected some data in the US and just a few other places. All in, we collected data in 13 different countries. I think I have a list. Yeah, and what's interesting is we really tried to get a broad spread where we'll have highly religious countries as well as highly secular ones, just to see how well the effect turns up. And it turns out, of our 13 countries, people everywhere assume that this serial killer was an atheist, except for Finland and, to a lesser extent, New Zealand. So it looked really robust across all these countries, which I think is really interesting. It's interesting picturing, students at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where most of them identify as atheists, and nonetheless, they're morally wary of atheists. I'll skip that one. Just another illustration of this stigma against atheism. We have a recent project, and again, another preprint if you want it, where we were asking the question of what are people's mental representations of what atheists look like? So in some sense, atheism is kind of like a hollow stereotype. If you know somebody doesn't believe in God, you haven't learned anything about what they are into. You can't picture them, eating atheist cuisine and listening to atheist music. It's not like a lot of other religious identities where you can form these inferences about what somebody's like just because you can guess what some of their shared norms are within their community. So to do this, we used a reverse correlation procedure. And essentially, you start with kind of a base image, and then you generate hundreds of odd degraded images where it just kind of tweaks them and adds noise. You guys had a poster on this over there, right? Awesome. Check that one out. Yeah, and then essentially participants, you'll show them 2 of these kind of just randomly degraded images. Then you say, all right, pick which one looks more like somebody who doesn't believe in God. And they do this time after time after time after time. And what you can do then is you can take all the images that they chose as, this is what an atheist looks like, and then you morph those together. So you can come up with this kind of composite image of what people's kind of implicit mental representation is of this group. So we did this where people would either choose which image looks like somebody who doesn't believe in God, or which image looks like somebody who does believe in God. So we can come up with a composite believer face and a composite atheist face. I'll pop the two composites up. See if you can guess which is the believer and which one's the atheist here. Yeah, so the believer face actually ended up looking like lighter skin. This is the most feminine composite-looking face we've actually gotten this. For whatever reason, when people do this task, like the resulting image almost always looks male, except evidently for the composite believer face. Whereas the composite atheist face looks like a monster. Yeah, he's creepy. And then what you can do is you take these faces, show them to a different group of participants, and have them rate various attributes of the face in question. So they see the composite atheist face is less religious, less trustworthy, less moral, less competent, more cold, more hostile, less human, more lazy, more unlikable, less happy, less attractive. Fairly gigantic effect where they thought the atheist face looked way more masculine than the believer face. And we're not sure quite what to make of the fact here that for whatever reason, people's mental representation of an atheist looked more African American than their composite image of a believer face. We also then showed these faces to yet another group of participants, and they'd see each face, and we'd describe somebody doing something either moral or immoral, and we'd have them pick, which of these two people do you think did it? And yeah, for every immoral action, they picked the atheist face. For every moral action, they picked the believer face. So again, now this stranger calls you up and says, "Pardon me, do you believe in God?" Well, against the backdrop of this potent stigma against atheism, we might suspect that people aren't going to fess up and out themselves as an atheist. So what happens if instead of doing it with a telephone poll, if you still have the same stratified nationally representative sampling, but instead of doing it with a phone call, you just have people fill out an online survey. So now they don't have to actually use their voice to say, "No, I don't believe in God." They can just click a button. We had one of these. And that ups the estimate to about 17%, which is interesting. So now it's, yeah, literally it's just people don't have to say they don't believe in God. If they indicate it some other way, yeah, our estimate keeps getting higher and higher. But again, that might not even be the full story. So we wanted to find a fully indirect measure where people could essentially indicate to us that they don't believe in God without having to directly say it or even click the button. So we found a nice indirect measurement task after combing through some, it was in sociology and criminology work, where, for instance, you're trying to estimate the prevalence of criminal behaviors. You can't just ask people, how often do you smoke crack? Yeah, that's not really going to work. Or problem drinking, date rape, ivory poaching, perpetration of anti-gay hate crimes. So we found a task that's been used to estimate the prevalence of all of these behaviors. And it's called the unmatched count technique, and it works essentially like this. You get a whole bunch of people, randomly split them into two groups, and they get a count task. So you say, all right, I'm going to give you some statements. Tell me how many of them are true for you, but you don't have to tell me which ones are true. So our baseline group gets just some kind of mundane statements. So I own a unicycle, my favorite color is red, I like hot dogs, I have pets, I brush my teeth daily. Each participant just gives you a number. Some people will say 2, some people will say 4, whatever. Then we have kind of our more critical condition where they do the exact same task, and you give them the exact same list of 5, and then you add one item that you actually care about. So I own a unicycle, my favorite color is red, I like hot dogs, I have pets, I brush my teeth daily, I occasionally date rape people. Again, some people will say, oh, 2 of those are true for me, some will say 4 of those are true for me. And what you can do is if you just subtract out the average score from the baseline group from that sensitive group, Presumably, any difference between these two groups, you can chalk up to whatever the sensitive item was that you added in. So we did essentially that, where, yeah, we'd ask people, indicate how many are not true of you. And then, yeah, our baseline group gets these 5 boring statements. Our other group gets the 5 boring statements plus the statement, I believe in God. So any difference between these two should be the people who would say that I believe in God is not a true statement about them. And we actually had 2 separate nationally representative samples of 2,000 people apiece. And yeah, across the 2 samples, we did slight tweaks to the wording of our question for belief in God. And we also were able to collect some kind of basic demographic information just to see how atheism prevalence would vary across different demographic groups. And our overall estimate now is 26%. Yeah, that was our most credible estimate. We used Bayesian estimation for it. So essentially, we have a distribution of possible prevalence estimates. And how this works, the higher up you go, that's your more credible estimates. Lower down is estimates that aren't very credible at all. So 26% is our best guess, but it really could be 20%, could be 35%. But it looks almost certainly higher than, say, Gallup's estimate of 11%. And really, this is saying that 40% is just as credible as 11%. Now, I think this can be somewhat problematic because most of the theory in the cognitive science of religion assumes that the vast majority of people are believers. So that's why we have these kind of religion is natural ideas coming about. And I think a lot of that is because the theory was developed trying to explain something that may or may not be a fact. So if our theory is trying to explain why 90 to 95% of people believe in God, but it turns out only 75% do in the US, I think this could really throw a wrench in all the works for a lot of our theory, and we'd have to rethink kind of some of the core assumptions we've been working on. And really, I always used to think this is a nice, tidy picture of my research program, but the more we work on it, the more I'm realizing it's kind of like this, where whatever we learn about consequences then screws with our basic theory up here. Yeah, so with that, I wanted to thank my lab members for helping out, and I'm done.
Okay, so maybe a question for Will, and then we can transition into a broader discussion for everybody. Okay, I see a question here. The mic's right there. Sorry.
Is atheism something that tends to show up in multi-religion societies only?
Oh, interesting.
Like, is it? I've heard things like if you grow up in a pre-industrial tribe, no one ever questions anything. It's as true as everything else. Is there something about either a culture of atheism or at least a comparison of and a perception of choice among religions that makes it possible?
Do any of you know any good data on that?
We have historical data from ancient India, ancient Greece. Now you'll have to look at how multi-religious they were.
I wouldn't be surprised, though, because a lot of what I think explains the spread of religious belief or disbelief, it does come down to a ton of cultural learning, where you're picking up credible cues from people in your community that this is what you ought to believe. So I could see if you're living somewhere where there are a lot of different religions, you're basically getting mixed signals of what you're supposed to believe. Whereas if you live somewhere where there's one major dominant religion, all the cues are telling you to believe in that.
It might be interesting to see if there's a correlation between the number, how multi-religion a society is and the number of atheists in it.
I mean, I think there's some data out there that children growing up in a home where the parents don't share the same religion, you see a higher atheism rate among those kids. And again, I think it's just because you're getting mixed signals of, how what the universe is all about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
To answer that question, there's also 538 data on American states and atheism, and it's almost a perfect correlation.
Yeah.
The more religions, the more atheism across states.
Okay, yeah, so let's open it up, and these are questions for everyone. I see a question over there, and then, excellent, okay.
I had two questions, basically. You talked about modifications to the UCT, the wording of the questions, and I was wondering what kind of, how what modifications were made. And the other one I have to make is that my son-in-law happens to be of the atheist variety, but science is his God. So he does worship at a temple. So.
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of the specific tweaks we did in that task, we varied the number of those kind of bland filler statements between the two just to see if that made a difference. In one of them, they were saying how many of these statements are not true of you, and we had the positive statement, I believe in God. In the other one, it was how many of these statements are true of you, and then we had the statement, I don't believe in God. Yeah, just little details, because we had a pain in the ass editor who made us do that.
Okay, so Kelly, and then I think we have some more.
Well, just a quick question about when the people did the 2 columns of questions, the not questions, did each of the 2,000 people take that and they did the thing in one column at one time and then the thing in the other column at another time? How did that work?
Everybody did one or the other. Yeah, so it'd be, 1,000 people did just the boring statements and 1,000 did the boring plus one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also. Okay, I'll just speak up. I have a question for Will. So when you had the 2 prototypes, the atheist and the believer, and you were surprised that the atheist was actually an African American, that's what people thought. Did you randomize the questions, or were they always in the same order? Because except of the first question, which was about religion, all of them were kind of leading to have these negative stereotypes, which you probably associate with.
Yeah, so we did randomize the order, but I suspect you're onto something that if people just have a negative stereotype of a group, unfortunately with race relations in the US, you add any negative stereotype and people are going to throw in African American as well. Thanks, people.
Right, but on that point, are people having a stereotype of atheism or atheist in particular? Right, so it's not that you're asking them, think of someone who is an atheist and rate this person.
Right.
I mean, you're not, I suppose you're not getting the same kind of prejudice that you'd get against ethnic minorities or African Americans, right?
Yeah, I suspect it's...
Yeah, people are not exerting violence against people because they're atheists, while they are against people who belong to an ethnic minority.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a different flavor of prejudice where I think it's less of this kind of in-group, out-group fighting and more just, if people find out somebody's an atheist, then they think they're kind of a moral wild card and don't trust them.
Yes, can we, I see a couple of questions over here. Perhaps, I know Fern has had her hand up, and Jordan also. Sorry.
Great. This might be a slightly European question, but in your work, you're categorizing atheists by those who answer, I don't believe in God, or I do believe in God. What about people who don't subscribe to Abrahamic perspectives, so spiritual but not religious groups? You're classifying those as atheists where they clearly aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had some other work where, especially back when I was in grad school in Vancouver, spiritual but not religious was the modal response. So this one, we ended up adopting this really crude binary classification, not necessarily because we think that's how psychology works, but we were trying to do kind of an apples-to-apples comparison with the Gallup numbers. It is interesting, though, so what's your thought? If somebody's spiritual but not religious, would they still count as the definitional atheist if they're not? Really? We can fight about that.
And Jordan, yeah.
So I was wondering if any of you found that atheists themselves have similar prejudice against atheists, for example, that you might find in people who have religious belief. And then the second question was, how much of the impact of religious belief on agency or actions involve a sense of either aggressive or other kinds of enforcement. That is, you know, you simply don't have the freedom of choice in some sense. You better behave like that, or so people would feel potentially oppressed by that. So those are two different questions. How do atheists feel about atheists? And what's the sense, in essence, of threat to belief?
Who's threatening whom in your question? I was just trying to get the. Who's threatening whom?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, for example, would you ever make a distinction that if you were in a culture, even a local culture, where atheism, for example, predominated, would atheists threaten other people to become atheists, for example, versus in a religious culture, do you find, for example, if there's a subgroup identified as atheists, do they feel some threat? Physical or otherwise. Social.
I mean, I could tackle the first question in terms of how atheists feel about other atheists, at least on our weird little sneaky indirect measure. Even the atheists aren't too fond of other atheists. We have some other research using more direct measures, just self-report stuff. And it looks like you get a weird asymmetry where religious people strongly distrust atheists, but atheists are really ambivalent. They don't care if somebody's an atheist or religious, at least in kind of a moral trust domain. So for them, it seems like religion just isn't a salient cue as to who you can trust.
Yeah, I see we have a question here.
And Jonathan over there. and
Okay,
here.
yeah. A couple of them over here.
Okay, thank you. My question is not regarding to atheist, but agnostic. Where did you locate the agnostic, which is the fashion in Europe? I'm from Europe, everybody's agnostic, and it's very well approved and very well accepted. As more as not agnostic you are, the best you are for politics, for example, okay? So that's one question. The other one is I have to, I don't know, I don't understand well the polls regarding to the question of, do you believe in God? I am a legal scholar. First, you have to define what God is. If I am God, I do believe in me. You know what I mean? Depend of the definition. So how accurate are those polls? When people, you know, probably if they ask me, do you believe in God? My answer will be, define me God. And then I can say if I do it or I don't do it. It's somehow related to the previous question, which is the agnostic question. Thank you.
Maybe you could pass across the table. But yeah.
Yeah, so how do we deal with the atheist versus agnostic problem? It's kind of interesting because you could argue that they're two orthogonal questions. So whether or not you're agnostic, that's a epistemological stance of how knowable is the answer to, is there a God? Which isn't necessarily a belief one, but then all the polls, yeah, they'll give you that menu and there's an atheist box and an agnostic box. But you could easily be both or neither. Yeah, and then for the issue of defining God for people, it's interesting. So Gallup's been doing these polls for decades, and they'll tweak the wording a little bit from time to time, but they never do a great job. Although some years they'll ask, do you believe in God? Yes, no. And then a subsample of their people will get, do you believe in God or some form of higher power? Yes, no. And the rates are identical, no matter which one they ask, which is odd. And sometimes the rates are lower. So you'll get fewer people saying they don't believe in God or a higher power than say they don't believe in God, which, yeah, people are great.
I have one comment on the vagueness of the term God. I think to a large extent that's part of the point. So it's easier to sign on to something in the sense of having a religious credence toward it if it's not sharp. So, and I think that's following the work of Dan Sperber, that's one of the things that's characteristic of what he calls representational beliefs. So it's like you're clinging to a certain idea or a certain representation, God exists, without being sure what that means. And so I think a lot of commitment to God has that character, which is being committed despite lack of clarity, right? So most people don't think like lawyers.
And then
I think my question was closely aligned with the others. So if I believe in a universal force that permeates all things, is that God? How would I fit in your study? It's not necessarily out of me, outside of me, or higher than me. It's just a force.
Yeah, I don't know where exactly you'd fit. Yeah.
Am I atheist? You know, in that category.
Yeah, I mean, again, we really don't necessarily like that strict binary classification, but at least for this study, we were just trying to play the same game as Gallup.
And that's fine, but I don't understand the results if I can't understand what was the operational definition of the results. But we're going along with this is the paradigm, so.
Yeah, blame Gallup.
Does the force you believe in have a mind?
Oh, there you go.
So feelings, desires, beliefs, intentions, knowledge.
No, if it is impersonal, it wouldn't.
Yeah, so it's not, if it doesn't have a mind, it's not, one thing we can say is it's not like the God that most people believe in.
Ah, what do you mean most people? What do you mean by most people?
And I think there's another.
This is the kind of generalizations which
or the
I
word
think,
people.
No,
well,
I'm
as let me rephrase that. So then it's not like the God that's portrayed, say, in the Abrahamic religions, which in those cases, God clearly does have a mind, right? So to me, it would seem inapt to apply the term God to that force that you happen to believe in.
But I do think we're sort of converging on perhaps a gap between what it means not to believe in God and what it means not to believe in anything either supernatural or super explanatory. And I think that's an interesting area where there's not enough research. And I think one of our goals today is to sort of identify those spaces and think about kind of what comes next. So John, and how are we doing on time? Okay, yeah.
I don't have a question for Will. And my question for Neil is not the same question as the one I asked before. So I was wondering whether or not you thought that Levy's physicist is in fact in a playground. So why isn't that your argumentative strategy, which is that, look, Neil is right. Neil Levy is right, that religious people are like physicists, but physicists are also, with respect to their scientific theories, are also in playgrounds.
Well, I think there's something very good about that suggestion, and what I like about it is this: a lot of our representations aren't like factual beliefs. So take the factual belief that concrete is hard. That's going to guide your behavior wherever there's concrete. If it's on the stage, if it's in the church, if it's in the lab, even if you're pretending that concrete isn't hard, in the background will be your factual belief that concrete is hard, because it'll guide your pretense in such a way that you don't injure yourself. So, but unlike factual beliefs, these what I call secondary cognitive attitudes, they are very much sensitive to context, and certain kinds of context or practical setting activates them. And so the fact that our physical theories become activated in like the classroom setting or in the lab setting and so on, to some extent that does make them kind of like playground beliefs, right? There's a certain context where you use them. But I don't think, but two points really strike me as relevant. One is that that doesn't really validate what Levy is saying, right? So what Levy is saying is that it's really, so why don't we use Newtonian physics all the time, right? So why didn't I do some calculations when I was stepping onto this stage? and so on. And it's not, it's basically because it's too hard. The processing of those representations is disfluent. And so I think there may be, at least for some scientific theoretical beliefs, there may be some practical setting dependence, right? I think that's entirely possible. However, that doesn't validate Levy's explanation of why we don't use religious credences all the time, and because that was making them analogous to a different feature of physical theoretical beliefs, namely the disfluency of processing them, right? So just to sum up, even if some physical theoretical beliefs are practical setting dependent, that's not what Levy was focusing on.
Yes, and then.
So to follow up more on this, Neil, I guess I'm having trouble with the physics example, the physicist example.
Yeah.
In that, isn't there a distinction between thinking about something versus doing the thinking itself? So describing the motion of a ball and according to Newtonian physics is one thing, but people are really good at catching balls most of the time, and they're doing the computation, but just not at a sort of propositional level, which then makes me think about religious belief and how if religious belief for many people is at this more kind of hypothetical level, how do you deal with the felt reality of these beliefs for certainly some believers under some circumstances? That they're not like the child in the playground who's making all the right inferences about their green piece of paper, but doesn't feel that the green piece of paper really is a frog at that moment. But a believer in prayer might really feel like God is speaking to him or her. So how do you engage with that affective, felt relational piece?
Let me deal with the second one first. So I think a great deal of make-believe play is incredibly engrossing and emotionally powerful. And I think a great book to look at on this topic, maybe you've looked at it already, but just think about it in this connection with the idea of felt reality. Take a look at Marjorie Taylor's book, Imaginary Companions. So wonderful psychologist at University of Oregon, writes about imaginary friends in childhood. And two things for me that are relevant really emerge from that. One is just how emotionally compelling the wants and needs of the imaginary friends are. But nevertheless, Taylor is insistent that the children never confuse the sense in which the imaginary friend is real with the sense in which, say, mom or dad are real. So the children never lose that two-map cognitive structure. But to grant your point, the second, you can have a lot of phenomenology that makes it feel like the imaginary companion is really there without ever confusing the imaginary with the mundane and factual, right? So I would say, sure, for a lot of make-believe play, maybe the green piece of paper never really does feel like a frog, but for a lot of it, when you're engrossed, it really does. And I think a perfectly analogous pair of points applies to religious experience in practice. So just thinking about Tanya Lerman's great ethnography of the Vineyard Church, people have to try really hard to get that feeling of God being real. So it doesn't just hit you like you ran into a tree. You have to try to make that experience happen, and it does happen. But importantly, the people in the vineyard use a lot of the same techniques that, say, kids playing make-believe play use in order to achieve that sense of feeling real. At least if I understand her work correctly. So that's how I'd answer the second question. With regard to the first one, people are actually very good at catching balls. I'll make this brief. There are different intuitive physical systems, and so catching balls, people are pretty accurate. Pressing a button for estimating when a ball will hit the ground, people are much worse at, and even physicists. And so I think the point remains that when you're pressing that button to estimate when the ball will hit the ground, you're not doing Newtonian or Einsteinian mechanics. Why not? Well, because that kind of reflective propositional processing of theoretical representations is too disfluent, right?
Okay, there's a question here that's waited for quite a while, so please go ahead.
A topic that's been battled around by everyone here is intuition, analytic. It's been battled around for many years now with religion. And Miguel, you were talking a lot about culture and divergent processes with respect to religion across cultures. And I don't understand why we assume intuition to operate in similar frameworks across cultures. For me, religion is not intuitive because I've lived within a secular framework for a long time, whereas somebody even in this state who's lived in a different framework, religion is intuitive, just based on the kind of concept knowledge we have. Your theory about religion being this kind of make-believe play that we can buy into sometimes, it may be the case when you're surrounded by people who have a lot of evidence against religion, who are pressing you against religion, like surrounded by secular people. But I think in most cultures outside of the Western world, the intuitive framework is very strongly religion, and the reality is religion. It is factual. And so I think that you'd probably see a lot of variance if you're going to sample in other cultures. I'm not sure what experimental methods you've used.
Well, Will and I have been having this conversation because since he's done his experimental stuff, he's done more recent cross-cultural work where this standard task of intuitive analytical thinking doesn't come up as significant as his previous US stuff has.
Yeah, it's interesting. And there's a recent meta-analysis just looking at kind of that same cognitive reflection task measure of intuitive versus analytic thinking. And there's something like 30-odd published studies and pretty reliable evidence, but they're almost all coming out of the US. So as part of the 13-country one I was talking about, we also had the CRT in there and measures of religious belief. And yeah, that relationship shows up in the US and Singapore and Australia and none of the other 13, which is weird. Yeah.
The other problem is that when we're talking about intuition, we're talking about different things. So when Pascal is talking about the heart and God being related to emotional processes, he's talking about something, intuition, in a completely different way in which cognitive scientists are. But, so, I mean, in the UK, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 studies, I didn't mention one, in which we don't get any sort of correlation between either supernatural belief or religious affiliation and this kind of intuitive analytical processing task. Nothing. So I think it's mostly cultural based, really.
And I suspect your intuition is right, that if you're living in a culture where there is strong cultural scaffolding supporting religion, that kind of becomes the default intuitive stance.
Yeah, let me just respond to the last suggestion there. I think we just have to acknowledge it. It's an empirical question. So I think thinking in terms of make-believe on the playground is a very useful paradigm. And I think it will extend beyond Western cultures, but whether it does is very much an empirical question. So I cited a little bit of cross-cultural data from the Paul Harris study. And then there's also maybe ethnographic reasons for thinking that, thinking about the ancestors or what have you is akin to kind of make-believe play. But whether or not it's so is an empirical question. And what I was offering today I think of as a framework for asking the empirical question in a more sharp fashion, right? So I'm entirely open-minded about that.
Yes.
I think that in order to see it as make-believe play, you have to see an alternative reality. There's another way of thinking about this concept. And in a lot of countries, not necessarily countries that don't have Abrahamic beliefs, a lot of countries that have Abrahamic beliefs, there is no alternate reality. People don't actually understand how you can be an atheist.
Well, I mean, that's a very strong claim, and I would say it's an empirical question whether you're right that people's psychology works that way. But I think we should ask that question as opposed to presupposing that we know the answer.
Well, this is from cognitive ecology and ethnographic work.
Yeah, and I think we should reassess a lot of the very strong claims that have been made in that line of research.
Yeah, I have a contention with one of your major assumptions. One of your major assumptions is, so if religious people aren't thinking religiously, you're trying to find out why that is. So your assumption there is that we have a unified mind, right? You have a unified sense of beliefs and we're applying them invariably all the time. And that's not how we work at all. We have a mass of incongruent beliefs most of the time, yeah? And religious people aren't thinking religiously most of the time, particularly within Western secular cultures.
So how are you disagreeing with me?
No, because your implicit assumption is that if people are religious, they would be thinking religiously most of the time. They should be. Why, I mean, all the examples you're coming up, why is it that on Sundays they watch less porn? It's because, they're thinking more of God because, I don't know, is it?
So I think what you're disagreeing with is what I'm saying about factual beliefs, right? So I do say, and this might seem like a striking claim, that our ordinary factual beliefs are kind of constantly there for guiding behavior, right? Whether it's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, if there's a dog, we assume that it has teeth. If there's concrete, we assume that it's hard, and so on and so forth. And so what I'm saying is that our religious credences aren't like that, right? And of course, there are many reasons why internal representations that we happen to have might be fragmented or might not guide behavior in every setting. But I think it's important just to be clear for which class of attitudes that failure to guide behavior is not guiding, is what's going on. I don't know if that clarified things.
There's a huge social psychological literature talking about the disconnection between attitudes, so beliefs, and behavior, right? So we've known this for decades. It's almost as if you're trying to adopt a pristine, puritanical idea about religion. That's what I'm finding somewhat.
I'll say you've got about 20 seconds to respond to that, and then we're going to have a coffee break, and we can keep talking, all of us. I really sort of hate to cut this off now, but we still have a lot of day left.
So I think it sounds like you're saying there's nothing to be in, and I guess my response is that's not quite right. Maybe the phenomena I'm interested in.
I'm not saying that.
Are not surprising, but we still have to give an explanation for the patterns of behavior and non-behavior that we see. And the question is, what's the right explanation?
Well, we've got coffee now, we've got beer later, so let's thank our panelists.
All right, thank you.
Once again. And then, I think if you just step out into the hallway, you'll find some caffeine and maybe something sweet there. We'll be reconvening soon for the day's second symposium.